In addition to having a radar early warning system, British pilots operated close to their bases, while the Germans had to fly long distances, which limited their combat time. The German tactical superiority that had worked in ground campaigns did not translate easily to air combat. Although the Luftwaffe had a large number of aircraft, its bombers were slow and vulnerable. The fighters tasked with escorting them had limited range, so they were often unable to accompany them to the end of their flight. This left the bombers exposed to attack by British fighters, which took advantage of this weakness to shoot down large numbers of enemy aircraft. Despite the losses, the Germans continued their offensive, changing targets and adapting their strategy. For several weeks, they heavily attacked radar installations, hoping to blind the British defenses. They then focused on destroying airfields, trying to leave the RAF unable to respond. Seeing that the Royal Air Force was holding out longer than expected, the Luftwaffe adopted a new approach. At the beginning of September, the bombing raids were directed toward major cities, especially London. This decision was not solely a response to military necessity. The aim was to instill fear, break the population's morale, and force a surrender. But this new tactic failed to achieve its objectives. Although it caused destruction and civilian casualties, British resistance did not weaken. On the contrary, the population adapted to the attacks, and British propaganda strengthened the collective spirit. Authorities distributed gas masks, organized shelters, and established evacuation systems for children. Meanwhile, British pilots continued to engage the Germans, often with numerical superiority, but with a closer knowledge of the terrain and a ready support network. The German High Command, seeing no clear results, began to question the effectiveness of their actions. Although initially confident of a swift aerial victory as the weeks passed, their confidence began to wane. Aircraft loss figures were increasingly high, and production could not compensate for attrition. Furthermore, experienced pilots were becoming scarce. In contrast, the RAF was able to replace its aircraft more quickly thanks to its war-adapted industrial system and external aid. British fighters such as the Spitfire and Hurricane proved effective, and squadrons were rotated to avoid exhaustion. The situation became even more tense when intelligence reports began to show that the air offensive was not achieving its stated objectives. Key British defence installations remained operational, airfields were being rapidly repaired, and aircraft production had not halted. Rather than weakening the RAF, the campaign seemed to strengthen its resolve. This forced German authorities to reconsider the feasibility of a ground invasion. Although Sea Lion was not officially cancelled, it was indefinitely postponed, and assigned units began to be redeployed for other duties. Hitler, who until then had been confident of a favourable outcome, accepted that the United Kingdom would not fall through a rapid air offensive. The failure had a strong impact on the domestic perception of the conflict. In Germany, propaganda had been tasked with portraying military advances as inevitable. Each victory was heralded as proof of national superiority. The offensive against the United Kingdom was presented as a further step toward consolidating the new European order. However, when it became clear that the objective would not be achieved, the tone began to change. Official communiques reduced attention to the campaign in England and began to highlight other issues. The media stopped talking about Britain's imminent collapse and began to present the bombing raids as a punitive measure or as part of a prolonged blockade. This change did not go unnoticed by the population, which had been accustomed to a narrative of constant progress. Internally, the German command looked for reasons to explain the failure. Some blamed bad weather, others a lack of coordination between the branches of the armed forces. There was also criticism of the strategy adopted by Göring, who had promised that the Luftwaffe would achieve complete control of the air without the need for naval support. His confidence in the abilities of his pilots and aircraft was not reflected in the results. Divisions within the military leadership began to become more visible. Despite the experience accumulated in previous campaigns, this was the first time that the German army had not achieved its objectives immediately. The air conflict with the United Kingdom marked a turning point. Although it did not halt the German war machine, it did show that there were limits to its advance. The failure in British skies also had technical consequences. Commanders began to rethink bomber design, seeking models with greater range and defensive capabilities. Escort systems, coordination between squadrons, and supply logistics were evaluated. In parallel, alternative plans for future campaigns began to be developed. Authorities understood that they could not rely exclusively on one tactic or one type of weapon. While Blitzkrieg had been effective on the ground, in the air it required adaptations that had not been anticipated. The British experience demonstrated that an enemy with good technical preparation and the will to resist could alter the course of the war. Another important aspect was the response of the German population. Although there was no complete information about the results, it was clear that something had changed. The indefinite suspension of the ground invasion and the growing silence in the media generated uncertainty. Propaganda attempted to maintain morale, speaking of a future victory or a diplomatic solution. But for the first time since the beginning of the conflict, doubts arose about the infallibility of the leadership. Some voices began to wonder whether the United Kingdom would be a more complex obstacle than anticipated. These concerns were not expressed openly, but they were signs that the initial enthusiasm was beginning to moderate. Over time, the conflict with the United Kingdom faded into the background. Strategic priorities shifted, and it was decided to focus efforts on other fronts. Even so, the air battle left a permanent mark on military leadership. It was a lesson in the limits of aviation, the importance of logistics, and the enemy's ability to adapt. Although the German command attempted to present the campaign as a partial success, in practice it was a setback. The failure to defeat the RAF or pave the way for a direct invasion prevented the Third Reich from consolidating its total dominance over Western Europe. The Battle of Britain was an episode in which air strategy revealed its weaknesses. Unlike ground offensives, where conquered terrain offered visible results, in the air, everything depended on coordination, timing, and the enemy's ability to respond. The Luftwaffe discovered that having more aircraft or previous experience was not enough. The combination of technical, tactical, and human factors determined the outcome. The British managed to hold their airspace, withstand the pressure, and preserve their operational capability. And that meant that Hitler's most ambitious plan up to that point, to conquer the United Kingdom, would not be realized. The air offensive against England was not only a strategic setback, it was also the first moment in which the German military machine encountered an obstacle it could not overcome in the expected time. The consequences were evident in the redesign of plans, the reorientation of resources, and the internal perception of the conflict. The war would not be as swift or as one-sided as had been imagined. This episode demonstrated that organized resistance, combined with adequate technology and strong morale, could halt even an enemy that until then seemed invincible. The experience of that summer changed the pace of the conflict, and although the Reich continued to advance on other fronts, it would no longer do so with the same certainty of immediate victory. Barbarossa, the invasion that promised to end it all. After the swift and crushing victory in Western Europe, the German command's next strategic objective was already clearly outlined.